Welcome everyone to our webinar today, focusing on diversity and inclusion across markets.
Marcoms really has a role to play in facilitating better behavior, better communication, and company culture across organizations. Being inclusive is not something that can be achieved in one day, particularly evolving in an international market with lots of different cultures. One must remember that obviously topics as complex as D&I cannot be pushed without taking on board all these cultural sensitivities, which can really backfire when not considered. A mindset change is really needed in how we think about the policies, we establish them, and always remember that what you think is right as a Westerner, for example, might not be the case in other countries. And it's always questioning this and remembering that there are different ways, different perspectives. There is a lot of merit in trying to help countries that you might feel are more restricted or conservative, but equally also remembering that changing mindsets in countries where it's taken hundreds or thousands of years to get to where it is not just going to happen in one day or with one initiative. And sometimes pushing hard might mean pushback. Working in phases sometimes is a good thing, and what you might feel could be baby steps is actually a much better approach.
This was a very interesting case that we had very recently in Tokyo. About 2-minute long commercial from Nike featuring 3 young students that are experiencing discriminations based on race or cultural identity or ethnic identities in Japan. And it was to raise awareness of the discrimination that was not quite acknowledged in the white Japanese public, but also bringing the sports as a way to connect people together. So it was a very strong message. And when they released it, the Twitter was initially responding very positively. They're very happy to see someone putting the spotlights on those who are not really acknowledged in the wide scope usually. But then, right after that, there is a storm of those right-wing based people who are very against the acknowledgement of the racial or identity-based discrimination in Japan, led to think that Japan is purified, and they are very happy that there's no discrimination existed. And there's a big argument happening on Twitter, even among Japanese population who are divided against this. So it also brought up some political conversations as well. So this piece of raising awareness advertisement was basically putting Japan on fire for about a month or so.
A few weeks ago when we wrote our white paper on gender inclusion across culture, I spoke to quite a few people brand side who came up with this example of parental leave being extended to all genders across international markets. Some of the elements that came I thought were really interesting from a cultural standpoint, and things that global teams have to think about. One of them was around polygamy. So when developing the same plan across the African markets, the local countries turned around and asked them if they thought about this. If you look at the figures, actually 11% of households on average are polygamous, and countries like Burkina Faso, it goes up to 36%, 34% in Mali, 28% in Nigeria. So it was looking at how the framework could work within this context and thinking about it when developing it centrally. Japan is second and ranks highest in the allowance for men, which goes 52 weeks. And yet, only 6.18% of men in 2018 took some of their eligible time off. And the objective for the government was to reach 13% in 2020, which shows that, they anticipate that they would have this reaction. And if you look back at the reason behind it, again, you have elements of being judged, feeling of guilt, also uncertainty in terms of the revenue that they could generate during that period. At this point in time, as I said, the industry knows and acknowledges that this is a really important matter, but I think we're still at a place where we may not have found the concrete solutions. But I think this 3-step framework can help build better mindsets and ways of working around it. So educate your central teams, give them the tools, the ammunition to be able to put together the right frameworks, make them think about the local markets, what could work, what could be potentially a challenge. Engage with the local stakeholders, so that's both experts, but also your local teams, because they will give you a lot of insights in terms of what works, what doesn't. Build engagement programs, put together workshops or audits. And empower is about empowering the central teams, obviously, to do their job well. Try and think about cultural compasses or inclusivity compasses. Build the local frameworks around what globally you were establishing, but never forget about all of those elements that will help you be successful. And then in terms of measurements, I think it's worth thinking about KPIs and frameworks to follow the local insights. So thinking perhaps of different objectives per countries or per regions, because they might not be at the same level of maturity. And also timeframes. So try staggering it for each of the markets. Think when things could unlock, and what is the best approach, basically?
Sometimes the education is got to be self-education first, because I got to unlearn what I've learned so that I can learn anew. If you're going to be working with South Africa and you had to track South Africa since the 1940s, that was a system that held our people enslaved by the system. So history is important. We can't talk about just here and now and about the future. We got to be engaging the context of this country. If you're going to do diversity, equity, and inclusion work, you want to engage South Africa, you're going to have to think upon the history of slavery. You're going to have to think upon the history of colonialism. You're also going to have to think upon the history of neo-colonialism. Because how are we continuing to do business in country contexts where we are working as a power over instead of a colleague? We're going to have to learn a language and a practice that engages people in a much more equitable, diversity, understanding, and justice framework. We are now sitting in 2021 in a COVID-19 reality where political freedom was acquired in our country, but economic freedom still not accessible to a large majority of our population. We can't get down to making sure that future generations of youth, more especially women who are of a darker hue or in a racialized South Africa, who are Black African women. And if you had to speak to Black African women like I've done, they will tell you, not only am I Black, feeling the injustice in my country, I'm Black and I'm woman. So you can just keep adding the levels. This is why from a business portfolio, as you think upon the work that we can do, business is set well to do some amazing things. Even government might work slower, but business doesn't have to. Okay, this is what makes South Africa the complex reality that it is. 11 official languages and growing, different dialects, race categorizations of a racialized society. We have this great awareness of diversity, but diversity will be falling short in our landscape when it doesn't deal with justice and equitability and sustainability and eligibility. Many youth try several times over to beat the entrapments of a complex South Africa around DEI. And after they've tried a lot, still they remain unemployed. So what has to happen? The system has to change. I can motivate people all I like, but sometimes systemic trappings will trap you even when you're highly motivated. This means CEOs, HR managers, they have power in the framework of employee agencies to create a rhythm that can set in motion a sustainable future, an equitable future. Lastly, I'd say to you, within the time of COVID-19, we need to be aware of the shadow pandemics. Black Lives Matter didn't only happen in the US. More and more people are agitated about injustice, even in South Africa. The shadow pandemic of gender injustice, where we saw the COVID-19 reality coming in. Our country is made complex today by the abuses that are faced by our women and our communities that are in these spaces. Diversity, equity, and inclusion can work towards justice and sustainability if we all, as a global community, make decisive decisions to be courageous around justice. No justice, no peace.
Brazil has one of the most diverse populations in the world. For instance, the largest African descent population outside the African continent lives in Brazil. In fact, Black and people of color correspond to 54% of the Brazilian population. Moreover, Brazil has also the largest Japanese descent population outside Japan. Unfortunately, this diversity is not reflected in the media. Business leadership and decision-making are structured, which illustrates the systemic racism we face here. 24% of the audited companies do not have a Black female worker. 25% of them do not have women in the management level. And 70% do not have women with disabilities working for them. These rates are very distant from the recommended 25% diversity threshold, showing that the glass ceiling is real. But for some segments, the doors are completely shut. A more diverse context catches nuances and complexities that are not perceived in a more homogeneous setting. The lack of diversity is an open avenue for harassment and master suppression techniques affecting the mental health of non-hegemonic collaborators. Diversity contributes to find better solutions with more innovation, creativity, and engagement from the team. Beyond the increase of business income up to 33%, representativeness matters. But it's very much important to move diversity with inclusion and equity beyond the buzzword of marketing and publicity strategies. Diversity with inclusion and equity should mean businesses' policies towards inclusive behavior, which implies in biases cognizance in the industry and within the company itself, diversity census and developing accountability measures, promoting diversity in all levels, the C-level, boardrooms, management and operational workforce, against tokenism and the glass cliff. It also needs to address the organizational strategies and plans of action, dealing with recruitment focused on real skills, goals set within a time frame, and metrics of success, among other initiatives.
I born and raised in Chicago, but moved to the segregated South with my parents when I was a child. This was during civil rights. That was a bit of culture shock for me because that's when I saw the colored only facilities or entrances or, toilets, things that were just colored only and white only, definitely segmenting us. But I adjusted to that very well because Black people lived together. We were very unified. We supported each other's businesses. It was when the lieutenant governor of the state had a press conference about Black students wanting to integrate the university. And he used the N-word. He called us niggas and said we would not be allowed in. That's when I had this moment. My heart broke. And I changed because it left an indelible mark on my heart about who I was. I never thought about being Black until I moved to the South. The second thing is then I learned about market research while working at an advertising agency. I was knocking on doors, wanting to do research, and I heard over and over, too many times, that we'll call you when we have something Black. America is very diverse, but it is very, very, very segregated. Why do we have two justice system? And I do believe it's because America doesn't understand her history. Many women, Blacks and other people of color lead diversity, equity, and inclusion, but they don't necessarily have power or access to other opportunities. As a matter of fact, we've had this perfect storm of Trump, COVID, and George Floyd. We will never be the same again because we know now we can't go back to doing and practicing marketing and diversity the way we were. Not all companies are doing this, but many, many, many of them are. So they're looking at this approach and asking themselves the tough questions like, how biased are we when we recruit, when we interface with others who are different from us, when we internally offer advancement and leadership opportunities to employees, and then how biased are we when we're conducting business. I work in the market research industry. It has very little diversity. People of color are not necessarily researched independently with our different ethnic groups. That is so important to understand how we are different but not deficient. We are taught in this country to not talk about differences. People believe it's rude. It is thought to be divisive. But when you are understanding and insights about a culture, you can come together, putting people in context, understanding the history, being courageous around justice. Who would think that those are strategies for diversity, equity, and inclusion? But they are. And these are definitely simple ideas to have a broader, a workable, a sustaining diversity, equity, and inclusion industry.
For many of you, Japan is not a typical country to hear about when discussing diversity and inclusion. And I would like to explain why that's the case here. Japan is not that diverse. That's what people would think. And I think that's true. If you think of the demographic composition of the country, even among the community that are passionate about diversity in this country, when we're talking about what should be done in the future, many people said, we need to make sure there's diversity in Japan. And that's very astonishing to me to hear, because diversity is already here. It's not a question of if diversity is here or not. The question it should be if the diversity has been acknowledged, if diversity has been embraced or not in the community. But Japanese public is not asking the question yet. I would like you to know that Japan is at the point to first of acknowledge diversity, and then finally we can access the inclusion part. If you talk about inclusion with the people who don't actually understand the diversity exists, that's a very problematic situation. I think the root cause is actually coming from the geographical identity of the country. So as you know, Japan is an island country, so it's very isolated. Imagine if you're stuck with the same people for thousands of years. You don't want to be different. You don't want to state your opinion that could be too different from others so that you can avoid the troubles. But you want to look like others. And this is the mentality of Japanese people. So that actually created this agreed Japanese identity. When Naomi Osaka became very popular, many Japanese people said she is not Japanese because she doesn't look like it. On the other hand, if you look at the marketing, we see a lot of white people on advertisements. Or even like Japanese brands, they always use white models. And they're very racially picky in a way. That's the norm. Even the Japanese population, they are unconsciously having such a strong idea of the racism when they're looking at some portfolio on the internet or marketing advertisements. So for us to talk about inclusion, we're still at the point of acknowledging diversity. That's a very important thing to understand. Recently, global Japanese firms such as Uniqlo, they started introducing more models when they're producing their new lines. And they're one of the first actors to promote on diversity. But then they're really challenging how Japanese people define beauty. And that has been very difficult, but then they're slowly transitioning Japanese public, and it's been working. If you're to really implement some strategies to make sure that your marketing plans or advertisement plans would work in Japan, or if you want to make sure that Japan is actually headed towards a pure diversity and inclusion portion, sometimes you might need to challenge the public of the Japanese people. If I'm to market something to the community here, from the foreign perspective, I might want to make sure the Japanese people would actually like my advertisement. But if you're to pursue the true inclusion, true idea of the diversity and inclusion, you might have to disagree with what the public would like today, because they're not exposed to that same sense of diversity and inclusion yet. If you're to really be successful in the future, then you have to challenge the public today. There has been a big population of the Korean people migrated to Japan during the occupation of Japan of the Korea. And they're forcibly brought here, but then some of their families still live here, and then their families have been here in Japan for such a long time. And by the appearance or by the names, they're still being discriminated very badly, and that's very disappointing. Again, this was the issue that Nike tried to bring up in their advertisement. So I hope this little bit of brief, it's giving you the idea that Japan is still really behind all of these three countries that have been on stage today. That's why it's very important for the global firms to really implement something that has been successful in other countries, might be very risky, and you might have to do a very strategic planning to make sure that you're not only targeting the population's preferences, but also you're addressing the right issues in a very right way.
But I wonder if you can elaborate on the difference between diversity and inclusion, and also the distinction with DEI.
Now in the diversity inclusion space are thinking about equitability. We talk about diversity and we say, well, we're all invited to the party. But in another fashion, you think upon what's the use of being at the party when I can't dance? The music is not thinking about me. It's leaving me like a wallflower. So when you think about that, diversity might be about the number game, but what's the use if you're just balancing the number game, calling them diversity candidates or, equity candidates, and yet they don't feel the belonging of inclusion and equitable human engagement and dignity.
I think about diversity as, like Seth mentioned, a variety of people. Inclusion, when I think about inclusion, it's about the eye for the invitation, to be invited into the room, an invitation to have a seat at the table, and then the invitation to have your voice heard. And then not only to have your voice heard is to put some action around what you were saying. The variety, the invitation should also lead to equity, equal opportunities for advancement, promotion, pay.
What tips and suggestions can you give when it comes to creating one global diversity an inclusion strategy that covers all regions and therefore all ranges of cultures.
And I think it's critically important to understand the different phases of diversity and inclusion, acknowledging what could be the good actions or strategies that could be taken by each country. I think it's very important to have the global strategy as the milestone and the local strategies as like concrete actions that could be taken. And I don't essentially think the global strategies should be something that would tell each country what exactly they could do, because I think that should be left for each country to think and consider. Of course, global headquarters should be assisting them, but also you need to give the opportunity for them to think about what they could do. You could set ideal, what's your vision on diversity and inclusion as a company, what kind of society you want to define. This needs to be made clear under the agreement of everyone from different, let's say, country representatives. Once you can define this ideal state of diversity and inclusion from the company perspective, then you could start thinking of like how we could actually approach that as a global company. Again, without specifying the concrete actions in each country.
So when it comes to development goals, I mean, if you don't have any goals in your company right now, jump on board. SDGs put it out. And it does require activism of corporate leaders to say, we can't take that no for an answer. We need to work out a new way. Even if it's so designed that it's a global position, how do we make sure that when we place that person there, more people from the locality are being brought alongside with them?
But the idea of DEI voluntariness, if you like, voluntary, where companies develop and implement policies and practices is not working. So do you agree that the voluntary nature of this globally is not working and we need some different framework?
When I think about the George Floyd and Black Lives Matter protests, it became a global protest. The common denominator was empathy, but there tends to be a deficit of empathy at the senior level. If it's not a strong message coming from senior leadership or support, it typically will fall apart. But when you include empathy, the whole idea of walking in another's shoes and wanting to understand them, you have a much richer and better diversity, equity, and inclusion program.
Diversity and inclusion, and diversity with inclusion, as I like to say, should not be only about publicity. It should be about actual policies toward inclusive behaviors in companies, and also social responsibility, building a more justice society, because it benefits us all. The leadership, the senior leaders of global companies, but not only global companies, also local companies are accountable of that.
So we will conclude, and I will borrow one of Seth's phrasing here, with courageous advice for the brands and the agencies that are watching us.
Here in Brazil, would be very important to promote recruitment based on real skills and experience, and not only on formal qualification and education, because formal education and qualification excludes most part of people that are amazing, and focusing on real skills and experience could be a more inclusive recruitment policy. Please don't use diversity only as a marketing strategy or as tokenism. Within a connected world, it's an invitation for a cultural blunder. Please invite experts, have diverse teams, and talk. It's not rude to talk about diversity, and that's the only way, dialoguing, that we can learn from each other and raise awareness. There is not democracy with racism, so we need to end discrimination and other kind of prejudices in order to have an actual democratic society.
There's not enough research on the individual ethnic segments. Businesses and business leaders have a tendency to roll us all into one study. Investing in qualitative research to have conversations, quantitative to measure is very important. And then the don't would be, to complement that, is to don't make assumptions. Because when you're making assumptions, many times you're buying in to the existing stereotypes that are out there about these different categories, which has led many brands to make many mistakes in terms of marketing and diversity, equity, and inclusion. So not understanding the code. Don't make assumptions, do research, particularly with the individual segments.
One do has been to take the risk to assist people that require your assistance. So if you're in management, if you're in executive leadership, if you are even a person without power, and alongside the risk, try to do it with community. So if you haven't got a community around you currently that informs you, that speaks to you, that coaches you, for you to not just wait on an invite, because that's another reality. So the do is about taking the risk with community. The don't is, don't do diversity like you heard Ana saying, just for the tick box exercise. I mean, this is a global phenomenon that we only do what is the minimal requirement for us. So there is no event, if you're working courageously with a commitment to common good and the equality of all for justice, then your DEI work doesn't have to be cheap and it doesn't have to be a waste of time. Every effort is moving us forward.
Do not implement the strategies that could have been successful in other countries because it would be successful in those countries. Japan is very unique, as I've mentioned. So the strategies that might have been successful in all other countries might not be successful in this country. It could be a little bit contradictory, but do challenge the public of Japan. They would need to be challenged. They're waiting for someone to open up their minds.